The Center for Indigenous Science was established this semester to be a place where Indigenous epistemology, theory, and methodologies are practiced alongside, within, and occasionally against the social sciences, humanities, and life and physical sciences. A key goal of the center is collaboration with Native nations and Indigenous peoples, as well as outreach and training to recruit and retain Native American and Indigenous scholars to make sure we feel included and that our voices are heard. In keeping with that, we would like to start today by acknowledging that we are on the land of the Peoria, Kaskaskia, Piankashaw, Wea, Miami, Muscooten, Ottawa, Sauk, Meskwaki, Kickapoo, Potawatomi, Ojibwe, and Chickasaw nations. These nations were forcefully removed from our traditional territories, and these lands continue to carry the stories of these nations and our struggles for survival and identity. As part of an institution created through the Moral Act, sometimes also called a land grant institution, we have a particular obligation to recognize the peoples of these lands and the histories of dispossession on which the university rests. With the introduction of the Center for Indigenous Science, you'll perhaps recognize that it is especially appropriate and exciting that our first talk is by Dr. Riley Tatsingfang, who comes to us from the University of Arizona Native Nations Institute, where she's a postdoctoral researcher. She received a PhD in communication from the University of California, San Diego in 2021. Her areas of research, and importantly, community and public work, include ethics of emergent technologies, Indigenous futurism, decolonial science, community engaged research, data governance, Native and Pacific cultural studies. And she has already had publications in Nature Biotechnology, Environmental Science and Policy, the Journal of the American Medical Informatics Association, Journal of Community Genetics, Human Biology, and the Handbook of Critical Intercultural Communication, among others. So I'm very glad you're all here to join us for this talk. Please join me in welcoming.
Okay. Thank you so much. Buenas and hafa day, Todos. Hello and welcome, everyone. I want to extend a big Sizus Mase or thank you to Professors Jenny Davis and Ripon Molly for the invitation to the Center for Indigenous Science and others like John McKinn and Dulce Talavera who've helped organize my visit and make UIUC such a welcoming place to land. So the title of my talk today is Editing Islands, Indigenous Governance of Gene Drives in the Pacific. Okay, and before I launch into things, I'll take a few minutes to introduce myself and kind of, orient you to my theoretical approach to my research. Then I'll spend the majority of this talk telling you about my dissertation research, which focused on Indigenous governance of an emerging genetic engineering technology known as Gene Drive, and in particular, proposals to test and use these technologies on islands. And then I'll close with a really brief mention of some of my new projects and directions that have grown from this work. Okay, so I'm going to introduce myself. My name is Riley Tatsingfang. I'm a postdoc at U of A in the Native Nations Institute. I am of Chamorro, Portuguese, English, and Irish descent. These are some of my relatives and community members pictured here on the slide. For those who don't know, Chamorros are the indigenous peoples of the Mariana Islands in Micronesia and Oceania. This includes the island of Guahan or Guam, where my family is from. And I myself am a diasporic Chamorro, meaning I live away from our home islands. And this is actually the case for a lot of Chamorros, as we're the most geographically dispersed Pacific Islanders in the United States. And this is resultant of many factors. Many of our family members moved away from our home islands on the heels of World War II as they enlisted in the military or moved to the mainland United States, seeking out educational or economic opportunity. And relatedly, roughly a third of our 212 square mile island of Guam is owned by the US military. So this has shaped different patterns of displacement as well. And so I share this with you for a few reasons. For one, these experiences shape my standpoint, and in particular, my attunement to the interrelated structures of settler colonialism and militarism. And also because my community has taught me that being a diasporic Chamorro also means striving to be in responsibility to our home islands wherever we go. And so Chamorros around the world are doing this in all types of ways. And one of these ways is by revitalizing our language. So the photo on the far right upper corner is from this past summer at the first ever Chamorro language immersion program for adults held in Guam. And another responsibility we have is to the Native nations and communities belonging to the places where we've put down our diasporic roots. So in other words, recognizing our positions as settlers on the lands of other Indigenous peoples while we're in diaspora. And so where I currently live in San Diego on unceded Kumeyaay lands, I've gotten to see what kinds of practices our communities engage in to build these solidarities. And so this is an image of members of the Kumeyaay Nation greeting and blessing the Chamorro Sackman. This is the first full-scale seaworthy Mariana Islands outrigger to be built since 1742, made in San Diego by Mario Borja and other Chamorros. And I really love this image because it holds so much. This is what it looks like to collaborate and strengthen our movements together. And also because it communicates a lot about mobility, which is a theme I think a lot about in my work. Our ancestors navigated more than 4/5 of the Southern Hemisphere using traditional methods. And reclaiming these practices now is also reclaiming our identities as mobile peoples who've always known the ocean as a pathway for movement and connection. And so as Chamorros, though many waves of militarism and colonialism have met our shores and shaped our movements and migrations, we have a much longer history of moving around because that's who we are and because of these really deep scientific expertises that we hold. And so as I try to realize my values and responsibilities through my research, I feel really fortunate to draw on scholars from fields like Native and Pacific cultural studies, Indigenous studies, and Indigenous and feminist science studies. And so a few of my inspirations are on this slide. The late Tongan and Fijian writer Apelihau Ofa has asserted that as Pacific peoples, we come from a great sea of islands. And he was a really powerful voice in sort of challenging the notions of smallness that can get projected onto our home islands. Native Hawaiian or Kanaka Maoli scholar Nolani Goodyear Ka'opua encourages us to ask how our research can nurture reciprocal relationships and catalyze positive change. And Kim Tallbear reminds us that all peoples do science and all science is cultural. And I think this is a really powerful and cogent way to remind us both that Indigenous knowledges are, of course, deeply scientific, and also that all scientific practice embeds value systems and reflects cultural norms that it's really important to attend to. Okay, so now that you know a bit about how I come to this work, I want to tell you how I got interested in the genetic engineering space. And so the story starts at UC San Diego, where I was a graduate student in the Department of Communication beginning in 2014. And while at UCSD, I witnessed the rapid growth of infrastructure to support the development of new genetic engineering technologies in the lab. And alongside that, the cultivation of spaces meant to prompt interdisciplinary dialogue about the ethical implications of those technologies. So for instance, we have the Institute for Practical Ethics at UCSD, the Tata Institute for Genetics and Society, and Active Genetics. And they are convening a lot of different folks across disciplines to talk about how to safely and ethically develop and use the technologies, being cultivated right on our campus. And so in 2018, I was thinking a lot in my own work about the challenges of doing participatory community engagement in science. And I learned that this was becoming a really kind of hot topic in the genetic engineering space. And so I was drawn to these discussions, and that is where I began to learn about gene drives. So as many of you in the room probably know, and maybe some don't, that's okay. Gene drives are techniques of genetic engineering that work by pushing or driving genetic alterations through populations of sexually reproducing organisms. They use advancements in genome engineering, such as CRISPR-Cas9. And using these kinds of advancements, scientists have developed gene drives capable of circumventing normal patterns of inheritance. So if you take the example of mosquitoes, and mosquitoes are a very popular target of genetic modification, including gene drive. Let's say you have a genetically modified mosquito represented in the blue, and it mates with a wild type mosquito in the gray with typical Mendelian inheritance. Offspring have a 50% chance of getting that modification from its parents. But with gene drive, the modification is spread through offspring at a rate of nearly 100%. And so this works through a variety of different mechanisms. For example, CRISPR-based gene drives work by making precise cuts to the wild type allele, then repairing it with an engineered version containing the drive so that all or very close to all of the offspring will contain the drive. And so what this means is that with certain gene drives, it may be possible to replace entire populations of wild organisms with genetically altered versions, something not possible under typical patterns of genetic inheritance. And so this has been a pretty exciting breakthrough in gene editing, and there are a wide variety of potential applications for gene drives spanning a number of sectors and fields. Most of the examples I put on the slide here are of gene drives that would spread modifications that either cause the decline or eradication of certain species. There's a variety of mechanisms this leverages. Some, for instance, spread mutations that block female reproduction, others spread sterility, others yet might bias sex ratios, which also can crash a population over time. And so a couple of examples. In public health, there's interest in gene drive to target mosquitoes that vector diseases to humans, so things like Zika and malaria, chikungunya, and others. In agriculture, there's an interest in targeting pests that spread crop disease. In conservation, there's interest in gene drive to target invasive species like rodents and mosquitoes that affect biodiversity or predate on native species. And then in a different kind of example, there's interest in Australia, and I think other places in these conversations and developments are a little more upstream, but about gene driving coral reef to be more resilient to warming and acidifying oceans. As I'll talk about later in this presentation, my work has focused somewhat on gene drive for bird conservation in Hawaii. So this would be targeting the Culex quinquefasciatus mosquito that transmit avian malaria to different birds. And so this work has attracted a number of different funders all over the globe. And I've put some of the top funders for you on this slide. So this includes the Mumbai-based Tata Trust, the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, and the US military agency DARPA. And each has invested between $70 to $100 million in gene drive research in a variety of areas. So combating malaria, controlling invasive rodents, and mosquito-borne disease. DARPA also funds research on how to control, counter, and reverse the impacts of gene drives. And I would note that while I was at UCSD, they received funds from all of these sources for this work. And so to date, no gene drive carrying organism has been released outside the laboratory. In addition to the need for continued technological development, there are significant ethical considerations that need to be attended to. And so these include uncertainty about downstream impacts on ecosystems, also the need for adequate regulatory frameworks to guide the use of gene drives. And in this vein, there's a lot of discussion about transboundary issues, right? A gene drive carrying mosquito is not going to sort of stop at our arbitrary political borders. So what does governance look like across different states and nations? There's also wide consensus in the field that some level of public acceptance should precede the release of a gene drive carrying organism outside the lab. And there's a lot of conversation about how best to engage the public or specific communities in informing these decisions. And so all of these considerations are intensified by the fact that some gene drives are designed to self-propagate indefinitely with the release of initial modified organisms, meaning that the release or escape of a few gene drive organisms with those kind of mechanisms could alter wild populations of that species, potentially on a global scale. And so this is where islands tend to come into the story. So a frequent recommendation across the gene drive literature is that isolated islands make suitable trials for the trial sites for the first outdoor releases of gene drives. And so you have these major reports like the WHO's guidance framework on genetically modified mosquitoes and the National Academies of Sciences, Engineering, and Medicine's widely cited Gene Drives on the Horizon report, making these recommendations explicitly, right? So WHO, islands as ideal testing locations for genetically modified mosquitoes. They recommend the geographic isolation of the site, so there's negligible chance of impact outside the trial area. and then from National Academies of Sciences, saying islands constitute an ideal, geographically isolated, contained setting to physically limit the dispersal of organisms. And so as I got familiar with this space, the regularity with which this presumption circulated in the literature and in the conversations around gene drive left me feeling quite uneasy, right? You know, as framings of islands as isolated and therefore sort of amenable to experimentation have had lasting impacts on islands and the people who call them home. In fact, views of islands as remote and isolated were the basis of justification for hundreds of nuclear explosions conducted in Oceania by the American, British, and French governments from 1945 into the 1990s. And so if you look at this map of nuclear explosions since 1945 by Gens and colleagues, the circles indicate the size of the detonations, the colors indicate the countries. So you can see the US is in blue, and the dotted circle I added to show you where Oceania is. And so while people are, you know, largely familiar with the nuclear histories of places like Hiroshima and Chernobyl, far fewer people are aware of the nuclear histories of places like the Marshall Islands or French Polynesia. For example, Castle Bravo was a test conducted in 1954 and was the most powerful atmospheric test ever conducted by the United States and took place at Bikini Atoll in the Marshall Islands. Bravo has been described by researchers as equivalent to 1,000 Hiroshimas. And so today, Marshallese and Maohi peoples continue to fight for just compensation for the environmental degradation, health issues, and displacement they've faced as a result of nuclear testing on their home islands. In these regions, Pacific Islanders and their descendants experience miscarriages, elevated rates of leukemia and thyroid disease due to radiation exposure, and many of them cannot return to some of their home islands that are irradiated and deemed unsafe for habitation. And so as I mentioned earlier in this talk, views of islands as isolated, prevalent, and powerful as they may be, are certainly not universal truths, right? Apeli Hauofa notes that colonizers hailing from continental geographies were the first to attach diminutive terms like tiny and remote and isolated to Pacific Islands. Scholars like Elizabeth DeLury have studied the communicative systems that maintain this myth of isolation, right? That is how islands are imagined and then treated as natural laboratories given their perceived isolation. And so as my project took shape, I identified two overarching goals. One was to interrogate how science, militarism, and colonialism work together to perpetuate the myth of island isolation. And another was to invite new approaches grounded in more oceanic ways of knowing to guide scientific discourse and practice, including related to gene drive technologies. And so approaching this work as a communication research, I was interested in studying the meaning-making practices that contribute to the myth of isolation in gene drive research. And I undertook this investigation through two main methods. One was through qualitative analysis of key documents and literature on gene drive. And so a guiding question for me was, how are these claims that islands make ideal test sites for gene drive presented in the scientific and regulatory literature? And this meant, you know, looking at how those recommendations are articulated and also paying attention to the broader discussions and narratives that they're embedded in. And the other major focus of my research was on public and community engagement. And I studied this through ethnographic methods. And so in thinking about other instances where the myth of island isolation has been mobilized to justify different forms of experimentation on islands, it's largely been without consultation or gaining consent of local communities and indigenous peoples. So in the gene drive space, I was really interested in investigating what folks are doing to kind of make good on all of this talk about public authorization and community engagement. And so I studied this through ethnographic research of emergent engagement practices on two islands where gene drive research is underway in Hawaii. And my interest was in learning how scientists, conservationists, and other are imagining and conducting engagement and kind of looking at what values and epistemic norms might be embedded in those practices. And then also talking to local indigenous residents of these islands and getting their thoughts on how they want to be engaged in these activities, if at all. Okay, so now I'm going to walk you through both parts of that research project, and I'll really just scratch the surface of it to frame some key takeaways for you. So for my document analysis, I took a qualitative approach informed by grounded theory and situation analysis, and I began with 5 documents. This included 2 longer form guidance framework reports from NAS and WHO that I mentioned, and 2 papers from the IUCN conference proceedings, Genetic Frontiers for Conservation, that were focusing on gene drive for island biodiversity, and then the entire report from NC State's workshop on gene drive for island biodiversity, targeting rodents. And so what I found was that the literature recommends that gene drive development follow this stepwise or phased approach. And so moving from highly contained laboratories to open settings. And my investigation really focused on phase 1 and 2. So phase 1 encompassing laboratory studies and laboratory population cages. And then phase 2, physically confined field trials or ecologically confined field trials, which refers to field trials on islands. Physically confined could be other things like in greenhouses or other kind of built structures. And so I began with an initial reading of each document to locate discussions on islands as field sites, and then analyze those sections, identifying trends and themes, and using qualitative coding. And the kind of substantive themes that I located were biosafety, containment, and confinement. And so my analysis paid really close attention to the way the island geographies were configured in relation to these topics in these texts. And so as I familiarized myself with the conversations on islands and gene drives through these documents, I also expanded my data set to include 3 additional texts that were referenced frequently throughout these. And these were focusing on protocols to safeguard experiments with genetically modified organisms, including gene drives. And this allowed me to gain greater insight into the sort of material practices and protocols through which biosafety, containment, and confinement are operationalized in this work. And so what I found is that containment refers to the laboratory setting and is thoroughly detailed as a process achieved and maintained through material infrastructure and stringent protocol, right? So you have layers of containment through physical structures and physical containers, often contained inside other containers. And there's also a whole host of specific policies and procedures aimed at managing the movement of humans and non-humans throughout the lab space. Now, alternatively, confinement, which is the term used to talk about trials on islands, is mostly presented as a natural or self-evident quality of island geographies, right? So this idea being that as research progresses, islands themselves will kind of do the work of facilitating biosafety absent the built structure of the laboratory. And in this literature, there's just far less operationalizing of how confinement will be ensured in island settings. So despite multiple statements in the NAS report that islands are ideal isolated settings for these trials, no evidence is offered to support this claim or elaborate on why islands are suitable geographies for gene drive trials. The WHO report operationalizes confinement somewhat, though this conversation was more focused on the challenges of combining test and control groups, so to not have kind of cross-contamination across with wild type and modified mosquitoes. And so the question is, how isolated is isolated enough? And the only evidence really mobilized to this end by WHO was a reference to a 1997 study on mosquito dispersal that says, quote, 2 kilometers will probably be sufficient to confine organisms modified with self-limiting mechanisms, and that organisms with other types of drives will simply require greater distances of separation. And so this 2-kilometer figure comes from data that's typically treated as common knowledge today that suggests that mosquitoes are capable only of flying short distances, typically a few meters, and in rarer cases up to a few kilometers. But we also know, and that 1997 study also acknowledges, that mosquito dispersal can of course be facilitated over longer distances via wind, and much longer distances yet via human-assisted transportation such as ships or planes, right? Indeed, the arrival of mosquitoes to places like Hawaii, where they are not native, is believed to have happened upon European whaling ships throughout the 19th century. So I argue that proposals to test gene drives on islands reflect entrenched associations of island geographies with isolation, and that all of this rhetorical emphasis on safety and security really obscures the degree to which these proposals prescribe that risk be displaced onto island geographies. Something else I found really fascinating in the document analysis was the use of particular set of imaginative practices in expert convenings on gene drives and islands. For example, in this workshop, where they convened a variety of experts sort of spanning the natural and social sciences and policy, coming together to talk about rodent eradication on islands, participants were asked to engage in fictional island scenarios. And so you have, might be a little hard to see on this chart, but you have in the left column, island selection criteria. So this is anything from size, distance to mainland, what kinds of organisms are present, what's the regulatory oversight, among other things. And then you have in the remaining columns, islands A through D, that kind of check different criteria for those boxes. And the ask was that participants vote on their top two preferences for an imagined first field trial location. And I find this really interesting because, you know, I set out to read kind of between the lines in these documents and understand, like, how is it that islands come to be imagined as field sites? And here you have participants being quite literally asked to participate in this kind of imagination. And of course, these discursive and imaginative practices matter, right? These proposals are not only in the imaginative realm. This is a screenshot from the University of California Malaria Initiative, which is a partnership among several UCs working on gene drive for malaria. And so not a fictional scenario, but a preview of the actual processes that this group is taking on to select trial islands that, in this case, can simulate the continental sites that are intended for eventual open release across several African countries. And so this brings me now to my ethnographic research. I was interested in seeing how public and community engagement is taking shape in actual real island settings where gene drive research is underway. So I conducted ethnographic observation and in-depth interviews on the islands of Oahu and Mokuokeawe, or the Big Island of Hawaii, where a variety of biologists, conservationists, and others working across federal, state agencies and universities are interested in gene drive, among other genetic modification techniques to target, as I mentioned earlier, the mosquitoes that vector avian malaria to different native and endemic birds. And so engagement was of interest to me, given widespread consensus in the field that some form of public or community input will be requisite to any outdoor gene drive release. And also given just how nebulous and sort of subject to wide interpretation engagement can be, right? I've also been encouraged in this space to see the explicit mention of local and Indigenous input. So, for instance, the Convention on Biological Diversity's technical expert group has invoked UNDRIP and talked about free, prior, and informed consent of Indigenous peoples and local communities, although there's flexibility in the language, right, might be warranted. And others have also pointed to not only engagement of local Indigenous communities, but the importance and the value of integrating multiple forms of knowledge, including Indigenous knowledge, right, coming from the NAS report. And so, of course, talk is great, but the question for me was, how is it actually taking shape on the ground? And so at the time of my research, gene drives were actively being developed on both Oahu and Big Island. However, engagement practices were fairly nascent at the time, yet there was some engagement underway, and it was definitely top of mind for folks working in the space. So I used interviews to talk to them about that too. And so as I connected with folks from different state and federal agencies tasked with invasive species control, I was able to observe a series of focus groups that were conducted in Honolulu. And I want to highlight this for you because I found it to be a deeply fascinating experience, mainly because it looked something like this. And so this is an example of a client viewing room that is often used like in market research focus group kind of practices. And so in fact, the agencies partnered with a local market research firm and met in a client viewing room where conservationists and folks from the agencies are on one side in this kind of auditorium theater style seating, and local residents filed into the room on the other side of this one-way mirror. And so we can see them, they can't see us, sort of a thing. Then a facilitator with the market research org led a discussion with residents as the rest of us looked on. And so she read a script and asked questions gauging participants' knowledge of native invasive species in Hawaii. And meanwhile, the viewing room sort of fills with these quiet cheers when residents accurately identify native species, or especially when they express their disdain for mosquitoes. The facilitator described 3 different methods for mosquito control, including genetic modification and even gene drive, though she never used the term gene drive. And the session closed with message testing, in which the facilitator asked for feedback on mock commercial scripts and slogans about avian disease. So, which do you prefer, save our birds or mosquito-free forests? And so I was really interested in how this practice gets taken up in this space. So I conducted follow-up interviews with folks from the agencies about this. And so through these conversations, I learned that practitioners of this form of engagement understood it as a strategic communication practice. And this embeds sort of particular marketing logics and language. And in my view, also one of these more deficit model approaches to engagement, right, that emphasizes kind of unidirectional education of lay people into the technologies, often in hopes of garnering support for those technologies. I read the second quote for you here. One of the conservationists notes that there's people that are resistant, and then there's people that we consider the movable middle, and then there's people that are already doing the work. It would be really difficult to work with activists because they're not the movable middle. So you start with people that are somewhat open, definitely get the people that are open, and then you go to the movable middle and you start laying that groundwork. Another biologist working in this space noted that you get to the point where there's this ability to move forward and do something. There's a process of starting to let people know, hey, we're going to do this intervention. And then you get people in the community that will be like, why wasn't I part of this decision when the decision is now? And he says society entrusted these kinds of experts to come up with a solution. Then the communities, are kind of mad that they're entering the conversation now, but the opportunity was always there. They could have engaged. It's just that birds was not their thing. And so here and elsewhere, there's this idea that a couple of things. One is that opposition is anticipated and maybe experienced, right? And sort of interpreted as this roadblock to the progress of the technology. And also this kind of suggestion that maybe the onus of engaging is on the communities and not others developing the technologies, perhaps. More than one interviewee also lamented that Jurassic Park has shaped unhelpful imaginaries of gene editing. So this person says, every time we get this discussion about gene drives, Jurassic Park gets mentioned. And as much as that movie was fun, it's not done wonders for conservation or gene drives. And then he says, while there's a lot of uncertainty with gene drives, a lot of the concerns are the worst movie sci-fi fantasies that just are not biologically possible, right? So kind of this frustration around lack of technical expertise in communities, perhaps. All that said, there are alternative approaches being discussed. So a few university scientists I talked to were actually concerned with these kinds of marketing approaches, with one noting, we've experienced suggestions in workshops where people are like, well, how about just couching the language? As in, should we use a different word than gene drive? And we've seen this. If you look at some of the mosquito control techniques, changes in names of what the specific modification is to make it a little bit more palatable. And she says, we have point blank always refused to do that. And so I found that some of the developers I talked to in these university spaces were really committed to transparent communication and really interested actually in, what are more participatory approaches to engagement and how can we do them, though felt really under-resourced and definitely under-trained to initiate and sustain these kinds of practices. And finally, I interviewed a small group of Kanaka Maoli living on Oahu in the Big Island. This included educators, caretakers, community organizers, and kupuna, or elders. And again, I'll just scratch the surface to highlight major takeaways for you. I would say the most salient was that the mention of gene drives frequently prompted this broader discussion about technology and self-determination, and in particular, examples of military and scientific experimentation that has advanced without proper consultation of Kanaka. So for example, interviewees brought up the decades-long bombing of the island of Kaho'olawe by the US military. They also brought up exercise RIMPAC, which is the world's largest international maritime warfare exercise held every 2 years in Hawaii. They test and train all kinds of different military techs and forces from sea to sky. And others brought up TMT, or the 30-meter telescope, which is an extremely large telescope proposed for construction atop Mauna Kea in the Big Islands. And several interviewees also brought up University of Hawaii researchers' proposals to genetically modify kalo, or the taro plant, in the early 2000s. And so this was a project undertaken in an effort to engineer resistance to leaf blight and increase crop yields. And so concerns on these topics included failure to respect Kanaka self-determination. And they also underscored the centrality of Kanaka's more than human relations. And so as one kupuna described of the GM Kalo project, our first Hawaiian was Haloa and came from the Kalo. To genetically modify Kalo is a big issue. That's the kind of stuff I think about when I think about anything genetically modified. Maybe not Jurassic Park. Another kupuna said, if we were to remove Lake Waiau, which is a sacred lake atop Mauna Kea, we could hear about it in song and stories, but we wouldn't be able to experience it. And it possesses something that we need in life. And so I think these quotes remind us, as Nolani Goodyear Kaupua has cogently stated, that the aina, or the land, is not something but someone. And so a question for me coming out of this is, what does risk or risk assessment look like, and how would the stakes maybe change when land is ancestor? I also talked to Kanaka about what they thought engagement should look like in this space. One community organizer said it would be important for scientists who might not have cultural knowledge to talk to people who do. She talked about those kinds of expertise as being valuable to the project. And another kupuna said the most honorable thing is to involve the community. If not, that's hewa, or wrong, and we know about that. Further to this point, folks had a really rich set of ideas and recommendations about where relevant expertise lives within their communities and who should be engaged on this topic. So anyone from kumuhula to halau, Hawaiian civic clubs, local residents, farmers, hunters, conservationists, students, and others. And on the question of how to engage, there was a shared interest with my other group of interviewees who noted the need for education on native birds and their decline. And additionally, there was interest in starting dialogue from the perspective of historic and ongoing settler, colonial, and military projects in Hawaii. And there were suggestions to look to existing cultural and ecological revitalization projects to learn from the modes of engagement and decision-making that are happening in those spaces. And so how do I make sense of this holistically in this project? So a high-level takeaway from this for me is that this conversation around what constitutes safe and ethical gene drive research is really framed by these concepts of containment and isolation. And these frames are really powerful in shaping imaginaries of the places deemed most suitable for trials of the tech. And they're even shaping the way engagement is practiced, right? So despite these calls for engagement to be this more democratic endeavor that really opens up dialogue and makes space for mutual learning, the emergent practices at my sites were effectively foreclosing opportunities to engage local and indigenous expertise or build relationships. And so I read these as sort of containing practices in their own right. And so as an alternative, I ask, what might it look like to take a more oceanic approach to this field and work? And this is really where my continued work is focusing today. But to paint the picture a little bit for you, I see these as approaches that would foreground connectivity rather than isolation, recognizing the connectedness of ecosystems, and also building connectivity and relationships among the various practitioners and community members who are connected through shared issues like native bird protection. I would also see it as having a more expansive and abundant approach to what constitutes valid expertise in this space, and certainly critically engaging history as a vital resource for how we navigate shared decision-making in the future. And, you know, I say this for the gene drive space, but I think gene drive as a technology also gets us thinking about things we should always be thinking about with technology governance, right? And so I think there's a lot of lessons to be learned and applied in other kinds of emerging technology spaces as well. And so in the last few minutes with you, I'm just going to really quickly mention some of my current and new projects, and I love to talk more about those in the Q&A as well. And so most recently, I've led 2 co-authored papers on gene drive in the Hastings Center report. This one was thinking about how we might transform deliberative spaces to facilitate more meaningful engagement of Indigenous knowledges in this space. And the Nature Biotech piece was thinking about the value of a global gene drive project registry. This was sort of more focused on the affordances of a registry to disseminate technical information and just kind of collate information about gene drive projects happening globally in a single site. I'm working in other spaces now to think about what a registry that's more Indigenous or community driven might look like. And my current position at Native Nations Institute at University of Arizona is giving me new ways to think about this from an Indigenous data sovereignty lens. And so I'm thinking about how we can get local communities contributing their valuable insights in this space and how we might use a tool like a registry to also get those contributions in front of maybe gene drive developers and other kinds of decision makers and policy makers as well. Okay. So I will leave it there and just say a very big Sainamase or thank you for having me, and to all of the people who have supported this work in a space. Thank you.
Questions?
Let's stop share. There we go. Yes.
Thank you for this. It's really informative and instructive and terrifying. And so I love all of the things here. I'm confused by the kind of frustration part. Do the folks who are kind of talking about and components of these drugs, are they familiar with the kind of long-term tendency for species the mongoose? Impact of single species pollution on long-term like ecosystems, including the fact that mosquitoes are major pollinators on all of these big birds. So I mean, in terms of things like, yes, Jurassic Park, point, but actually I'm like, how is this not a mongoose solution, right? So are those ever part in any of the conversations, like some of the things that come up?
Yeah, great question. Thank you for that. Yeah, and honestly, in my experience, the conservationists in that space are really also sick of hearing the mongoose example too. They're like, that wasn't us, you know, like there's other right. I mean, I hear, oh, let me close this out. There it is. Often I hear explanation that, you know, these were like folks working in the sugarcane plantation. These weren't like expert conservation biologists making these choices, right? So there's some of that goes on, but it definitely comes up a lot in communities too. I mean, several people I interviewed were also, yeah, what about mongoose? What about these other examples that haven't worked out? And I think that for me, those are important considerations because it looks at what happens when you have too narrow set of expertise, right? Those kinds of decisions were probably avoidable if more folks who have experience with those species were consulted first, and if it was like thought through a little bit more of how it would look in practice. So I think that's a really important takeaway there. Yeah. Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Thank you so much for that talk. It's fascinating. I'm curious about the focus groups.
was it entirely about, like, was it all, we've done the research, have the plans, now we need to figure out how to message it effectively, like how do we communicate it to people, or was there an element of it of getting back?
Yeah, that's a really great question. Thank you. I would say it's about, from what I understand, like gauging public awareness, mostly to then strategize subsequent messaging. And as part of the larger set of practices that aren't just about like gene driver genetic modification, but just doing different campaigns to raise awareness about native bird issues and invasive species issues in Hawaii. And I would say that the fact that it's happening so downstream, like we already have these technologies in development, is also an important thing to recognize, because even if there is interest in, leveraging input, there's already limited ways you can do that, right? Like from more kind of community-based participatory approaches to research, the idea is that you're engaging communities at a very early stage to actually identify the challenge that you want to intervene in, and then later the solution, right? So I think that's also one tension in this space, is that a lot of these discussions are happening much further downstream in the technology development. So there's just limited ways to kind of bring people meaningfully into, for example, technology design. I know there are ways people are trying to do that, but I always note that when people are like, oh, how do we do CVPR in this space? It's like, well, we started that a little while ago. It's like, it's a little bit late. Not to say that there aren't ways that, communities can be really meaningfully engaged, especially in the decision-making process. But I think with respect to like technology design, it's a little bit harder doing it downstream like that.
Yes, thank you very much for that. Is there any push? Be pretty frightening to just skip over and we can eliminate malaria continentally.
Can you say more about that? Malaria, like malaria vectored to humans, or not the avian malaria? Can you say more?
The frightening thing is to just say, we are scientists, we can get rid of malaria on a continental scale. So we even need to do testing on island. I mean, that's really scary.
The testing on islands part, or?
Well, that is, what I'm saying, even more frightening is to just say, oh, we don't need to do that, we're ready to.
Oh, going straight to the continental spaces? I see. Well, I don't know, something that's interesting to me about the kind of phased pathway approach, like yes, I understand that it makes sense at an earlier stage of development to have containment, right? Because we'd want to lower the risk of escape of these organisms. But it is interesting to me, and this is what I want to interrogate more, is the assumption that islands would be the place to do that, right? There's other recommendations in these reports that there's other kinds of confinement practices that could happen at the genetic level, or that could happen in ecosystems. Like, you have islands. Islands can sometimes be a landmass surrounded by water, but it could also be different kinds of like micro environments situated within other ecologies too. So that's some of the conversation around confinement recommendation says it might not have to be an island. There's these other strategies for doing it, including like genetic confinement, right? But the conversation, what's interesting to me is just that the conversation always immediately goes to islands. Right?
The popular press, which is a great place to go.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think that in any project I've seen that is looking at trials for malaria right now, there's definitely a focus on candidate island sites. So I would say that is probably the direction it's going. Thank you. Others?
Yeah, the islanders, like alternatives that be more comfortable with, or that,
alternatives to these technologies.
To,
Right.
to like release or to sit there.
Yeah, that's a great question. I think there, there was actually a relative amount of like openness and curiosity to what genetically modified mosquitoes could do in this space. And I'll also note that like in Hawaii, it was a little bit of a different context in that the research is happening locally, and there is some more, it's a little bit different than these situations where you have scientists sitting in conference rooms in the mainland United States talking about doing trials in Tahiti, and they've never been to Tahiti, you know what I mean? So I feel like that's a little bit of a different context kind of across some of the sites I was looking at. But I would say that, there was of interviewees I talked to who were interested and concerned about the native bird populations, there was kind of curiosity and like interest in learning more about the risks, right, associated with this technology. There's also interest in, if not gene drive, like other forms of genetic modification. If not those, maybe like the Wolbachia method or others. So I think that despite this kind of intense fear of potential opposition that circulates in the scientific communities that I've worked with, like I didn't personally really see that a lot when I interviewed folks, but definitely concern about, right, undermining self-determination of local communities. Like I would say that's where more of the, concern is coming from, not just because nobody wants genetic modification necessarily. Yeah, thank you.
So there was one, I assume like a scientist with a Western background that said like, well, maybe birds just aren't their thing. Do you think that that's a perception among most of the scientists and like, people who consider themselves experts in the field? Do they have that mindset, and how much of a barrier that creates to them actually engaging local people who have like that local knowledge?
That's a great question. Yeah, I think that overall, folks I talked to in that space, like a lot of them, they are really tasked with this like invasive species management and doing this communication and kind of education around the topic. And they've been doing this focus group research, I should say, like for a long time, not just around these new kinds of technologies. So there's like a longer history of trying to kind of gauge public knowledge or awareness. And I think that for them, their experience is overwhelmingly that people don't know about the diseases that mosquitoes vector to non-humans. Like there's some awareness of like dengue because of the outbreaks across some of the islands, but that there's less kind of public knowledge more generally about how they threaten the native bird species. And so there's like all kinds of really interesting projects like in art and in museums and in the natural sciences to like get people engaged in the understanding that this is an issue. I would say that, yeah, his perspective that this is maybe a reason, or maybe like a frustration or a reason like not to engage, isn't necessarily universal, but I do think that the presumption that people just don't know and won't care is kind of there, which, to the contrary, there are lots of cultural practitioners who do really care and who like live in these spaces and are noticing the changes in the landscape as some of these birds are not singing their songs in the forest as much, right? So, and some of the conservationists that I talk to and work with in this space are Hawaiian themselves and have some of these experiences. So I think there's a diversity of perspectives, but I think overwhelmingly this kind of narrative of like, oh, people just don't know and care, like is there as well.
Thank you so much. I am really enjoying your talk. One of the things that you pointed out early on is that ARPA is one of the main, seems to be the greatest funder of drive research. I'm wondering the extent to which scientists at all talked about this, because it seems like my very limited understanding of the way a lot of is that it's pretty different than have very rigid progress reports you have to submit. It's like an text in science. setting speaks to that at all, or whether like science ever talked about that in relation to popular health?
Thank you. That's a great question. I wish there was more conversation about it, actually. I have some limited experience working in a lab, like a social science lab that had DARPA funding, and a lot of our work was kind of like similarly in this, I don't know, gauging public awareness or public perception and like doing science communication kind of side of it. So I could speak a little bit to that. I would say that a main observation for me in any of these spaces is the lack of acknowledgement that DARPA is the main funder, and a lack of acknowledgement that DARPA was funding projects on our campus and in our labs. We didn't really talk about that much, and it's made me uneasy, you know. And it's definitely, as with any funding sort, very conditionalizing of the kind of work you can do and the kinds of things you can say about the work that you're doing. And to speak solely from my experience, I will say that I think there's sort of this emphasis on the optics. Like that was a word I heard in that space more than working with other kinds of funding bodies or in other kinds of settings on this topic, was the optics of the technology. So again, like this is another interesting space where these kind of like PR and marketing logics are really at play, and definitely colonial and imperial structures as well. I wish that was interrogated more. Yeah, again, in my experience, it's not really a topic of conversation. So that's something that I'm actually super interested in building, like new kinds of tools to think about gene drive and make decisions. It's like, how do we actually map the structures of power and the concentration of resources that are shaping these projects? So one thing I've been interested in is like mapping sort of the pipeline, like where's the funding coming from, where are the labs situated, and where are the trial sites? And I did a mock map of this in my dissertation, and it's exactly what you would expect. It's like all global north funders and labs, and like global south and islands trial sites. The first genetically modified mosquitoes released outside the Cayman Islands by Oxitec, biotech company based in the UK, and their funding is all like coming from different places, also in the Gulf War. So again, these things are really important and really shaping how this work is happening, but I would say rarely talked about. So I think it's nice to have tools to help us like visualize that and put that on the table as an artifact to actually, you know, understand these kinds of dynamics and yeah, their impacts. Yeah.
If I can follow with something that the optics, like using that language right now is super interesting to me, because it's something like, this is only because I recently read about military funding of science during the Cold War, but during that cultural ambassadorship or psychological warfare. And now we're calling it optics, but it's actually a lot of the same thing. It's gauging public opinion, influence public opinion, as opposed to gauging public opinion to be better. If I'm understanding.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Well, I'd love to learn more about that. Thank you. Okay.
We talked a little bit earlier about how there are many parallels in the related genomics field, and I fully agree with you that community engaged research early on is really important. See how we can use these tools to address issues and needs. But one of the hurdles that I've encountered, structural barriers, grants to do that community engaged work before you even have questions. What do you have across any?
That is such a great question. Yeah, it is really hard when our institutions are not set up to support that work and don't incentivize or reward it, and everyone is stretched and needs funding. So I hear that, and I have seen other, like some funding bodies kind of restructure to better support CVPR kind of work, like the Corey Patient-Centered Outcome Research Institute is one example that comes to mind, more in like the health and biomedical space. They have CVPR grants where for the first year, you don't do research, you build relationships with the community, and it's like kind of a longer maybe needs assessment to understand like what is the question we even want to study. And so I think that's a really strong example of an institutional or funding body that is actually making a shift that's more aligned to these kinds of practices, right? Because that is a hard part, especially if you don't have the existing relationship, right? Having to meet these milestones and make these reports and collect data and do all these things in a kind of condensed timeline, really can shape and compromise the quality of the relationship you want to build. And then, yeah, I think really interesting projects can happen when you have more time to build a research question that's like actually genuinely gonna, you know, support the needs of that community. So that's one example that comes to mind. If others know other good funding bodies that do that, let us know too. Yeah. Thank you. Mhm.
Great, so a lot of interesting follow up on something with the defense industry funding for research along with limitations on what the research wants to say about it. Greater control of the world, hopefully they see all the research. The military is blocking research going on.
Yeah, you know, I'd have to ask my colleagues that do more of like the technical development about their experiences on that, but that's really interesting. And I think that's definitely been the experience of some of my other colleagues working in the social science space, navigating the DARPA world. I mean, I've also run into that with different like federal funding bodies too, is how you kind of represent your findings can be subject to different forms of censorship, more or less, right? Like we want to keep getting more funding from this body. So if we critique the project, then might that compromise it? And so I've had my own frustrations with that and like other, from other sources as well. Thank you. Oh yeah, thank you. There's so many screens and things happening. There is oh no. Oh, a very long time ago, Jane said it's difficult to hear questions. Can you repeat it? I am so sorry that I did not do that. But I want to invite, if any of you in the Zoom room have questions, please feel free to put them in the chat as well. Or unmute. I think I can hear you.
I actually have a really basic and kind of strange question. Given the sensitivity of the work that you're doing, I'm curious, and I'm not sure if somebody else asked this already, but, and given your exposure in that lab, in that workplace, to DARPA and DARPA's like typical, I'm wondering if you had the typical requirements of having to work on this very, very stringent schedule where you report with specific results. And they almost always require an outside corporate body to also be engaged, and how you negotiate those sorts of relationships, given the sensitive work that you do.
Thank you. I think that's a really interesting question. I'm afraid I can't answer it in a lot of detail because I was a little bit more peripheral to a lot of that work. I'd say the main projects that I worked on with DARPA were convening like expert workshops, so bringing scholars from different fields to talk about topics in gene drive. And in my experience, like, you know, I wasn't a key person kind of organizing those spaces, so I don't know that had some of the qualities of what you're talking about in that case. But yeah, I know there was like regular meetings to kind of report on milestones and things like that. And I know there was some kind of negotiation around like how we would name the conferences or things like that. And DARPA would like members of DARPA will come and do presentations and things like that. But yeah, I can't speak in more detail to some of the kind of more structural things in that space, since I wasn't kind of leading those projects.
No, that's totally cool. It strikes me as like it's something that technically a lot of us now have to contend with. I work in infectious disease. One of the largest infectious disease budgets in the nation is held by DARPA. They have profound amounts of money, right? And so And so often people get together and try to go for those grants, and it comes with all these other questions of like, how do you deal with, sensitive issues when you're literally being held to like a rigid military schedule and have to engage also with court, like quite literally, that's literally the way that they do it. They do it with their experimental science too. Like, we will get results on this set of experiments by month this, like, it's not, it doesn't fit a lot of like inquiry in the first place. And then on top of that, because these other bodies have to be involved. So, but I'm very happy that you clarified that for me. And I'm sorry that my question was a little off point. But it's just,
No,
that we talked about it. I thought like, this seems like something that we should be talking about, at least down the road, maybe.
Absolutely. No, thank you for that question, Jessica. And I think that it is really important to attend to how these funding bodies condition and shape the possibilities of the work and the practices. And like, I appreciate you sharing your experience, because I think it's really helpful to start the dialogue and to not kind of take these things for granted. So thank you. I appreciate that.
Oh, thanks.
Anybody else?
Well, one is by the fact that the word mainland is very continental.
Yeah,
Right.
exactly.
I understand you, right? But that's, so if you see the level of like the fact that a lot of this work is at, or at least outside the Hawaiian context, is happening in those spaces that are like super confined and global north and distant, in like imagining what the potential risks are, or what the risks, like the concerns are for the local folks. So I guess I'm struck by this, like, are there conversations about what it means to be potentially introducing genetic manipulation in context by victims? Like, I mean, because all of the like island context you're talking about, they're like, hey, this is a long history, today. Nuclear tests in these spaces is a thing, right? And they tend to say like both as a history and a reality. But if the things are being conceptualized, and even like people are trying to anticipate risks are happening in places where that is less reality thinking about, and not the thing that their field deals with, right? Like, so that's it felt like I kind of, the things people were bringing in were not the same kind of speculations of risk that the researchers were doing. Place could be part of that, right? Both field and
oh my gosh, yeah. Yes. All of that, yes. I mean, yeah, I think for, folks that don't have relationships or deep relationships to these places, there's a little bit of like out of sight, out of mind element happening. And I wonder the degree to which like community engagement practice or relationship could like fill in some of the contexts with like local perspectives, like you said, on risk. I think that's a huge one, is like risk is so contingent and cultural too. So like, how do we expand our conversations of risk assessment, or actually the processes of risk assessment, to account for social and cultural implications as well? And the fact that like social and cultural implications are not necessarily like independent of these more technical considerations, right? I recently learned that the EPA in the US, like they don't include social risks as a category. It's like more like, things that are risks to human or ecological health. And so there are other countries that do that for sure. So I think that's like, there are very like material ways that those processes like better account for that, right? And I think that, not having access or relationships absolutely shapes like limited imaginaries of what might constitute risk. And I'm stuck on the irradiated environment thing, because like, no one is talking about that. And there is work being done to look at gene drive and other GM techniques for mosquitoes in French Polynesia. And that's the first time I've heard anyone like make that connection, so yeah.
Well, also, I think the idea is that islands are the kind of natural sterile labs. Then are they thinking about those kind of contextual things where islands aren't sterile labs, but in fact have these environmental histories that are wildly different than those labs, right? Like I think that parallel between
confinement is a really such a striking one, but it also, I think when they're going from confinement, right, containment to confinement, right, like, there are a lot of things that aren't terrible in process.
That's such a great point, right? And so much complexity, right? Which I think is like acknowledged in a lot of conversation about like biodiversity on islands, and islands are these like hotbeds of biodiversity and all this complexity and stuff. But then at the same time, this like, you know, oversimplification. And I was like really weirded out reading some literature on like islands, biogeography, and some of these like the ways that some of like Darwin's work gets kind of extrapolated to talk about other kinds of scientific knowledge production, including these texts saying, okay, islands are like cultural petri dishes, like we can do sociological or anthropological studies of islands to understand these kind of like inherent qualities of how cultures evolve, like just ridiculous. Yeah. So yeah, I think I love that, and I'll keep thinking with that because I think there's a lot more to think about with the kind of complexity that islands have that gets like washed out of these framings. Yeah, explosion of actions and maybe.
Well, very simple question. Are there mosquitoes actually on the island?
There are mosquitoes for sure. They're introduced there too. Yeah, not native to the region, I believe. Yeah.
Ariane is not like
Mm-hmm. That I don't know. Actually, it's a good question. At what point mosquitoes were introduced in the Mariana? I'm not sure off the top of my head. Yeah. Yeah, but our forest birds in Guam and throughout the Marianas are mostly threatened by the brown tree snake, which was also perhaps introduced on cargo, maybe from military ships as well. So yeah, there are mosquitoes, but the avian malaria, to my knowledge, is not really the kind of driving issue for native bird species there.
I think we have enough time. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. Thanks, everyone. I don't know where to look.